Hello, my name is Ashley Purpura, and I'm an Associate Professor of Religion at Purdue University and the co-editor of the Orthodox Christianity and Contemporary Thought book series with Fordham University Press. I'd like to welcome you to this installment of Women Scholars of Orthodox Christianity, which is one of the many initiatives of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University. The Fordham Center, it facilitates, funds, and publishes scholarship on the Orthodox Christian world, broadly understood. To learn more about the center, its initiatives, or publications, please visit the website at www.fordham.edu/orthodoxy. We would also encourage you to follow the center on YouTube, click like on our programming, and share this and other videos with anyone who might benefit from it. I'm joined today by our guest scholar, Dr. Romina Istratii. Romina is the UKRI Future Leaders Fellow at the School of History, Religions, and Philosophies, and Honorary Research Associate to the Department of Development Studies and the Center of World Christianity at SOAS University of London. Dr. Istratii has over 10 years experience working as a decolonial international development researcher and practitioner to develop dewesternised, faith-sensitive, and culturally appropriate approaches for researching and addressing gender issues and domestic violence in religious societies in Africa. She has previously conducted independent fieldwork in Ghana, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Senegal, and her work is especially interested in integrating theological and exegetical responses to domestic violence alleviation programs in Orthodox Christian and other religious societies. Dr. Istratii has previously written on the ethics of international development, Western gender metaphysics and religious knowledge systems, and discourse of fundamentalism in gender studies. Among other publications, she is the author of the article Beyond a Feminist Hermeneutics of Suspicion, Reading St John Chrysostom's Commentaries on Man-Woman Relations, Marriage, and Conjugal Abuse through the Orthodox Phronema, and the monograph that we will especially highlight today, Adapting Gender and Development in a Local Religious Context, a Decolonial Approach to Domestic Violence in Ethiopia, and that's Routledge 2020. Welcome, Romina, and to all of those joining us. Our format today...
Thank you for having me, Ashley.
Of course. Our format today is similar to those of other episodes in the series. I'll start off with some questions and we'll have a discussion, and then we'll open it to a Q&A. So please do feel free to those joining us to put any questions you have for our guest in the Q&A by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We have disabled the chat for our participants, but of course that Q&A is there for you to put any questions or comments you'd like us to address at the end. And we may not get to all of them. We'll see what we can address before we get to the end of our time together. I'd also like to note that Romina might need to switch off her video at certain points in our conversation and just join by audio due to some connectivity issues. And I ask our participants patience with that. I'm sure everyone understands by this point of Zoom familiarity. And then secondly, as the title of this webinar suggests, we will also be including discussing issues of abuse and intimate partner violence in the Ethiopian context, but also more broadly, which our guest is an expert on. And I just like to note the sensitivity around those issues at the onset. So I'd like to start us off with my usual question, asking you to share with us a little bit about your background and what led you to your scholarly interests overall.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure, and it really is an honor, as I was saying, to have a platform where I can discuss my work and, to have someone like you actually read the book this carefully and ask questions that are, very detailed and at the heart of my work. So thank you so much for taking the time to actually review it and feature it. I really, really appreciate it. As I was saying, it's been a product of the past 7 years or so. So it's been, it's been in my mind, kind of cooking for years, and it hasn't been an easy process. So I'm really, really grateful for this opportunity, and I hope that those who are not with us today, I know there's conflicting priorities, can watch it later as well to find out more about the background of the book. And I really appreciate your first question as well, to try and contextualize the motivations behind the book. I think oftentimes we researchers or activists or scholars focus so much on our practice and our research that we forget the personal element and the subjective element of this process, which obviously is intertwined with our work. And so I think I'd like to really focus on that personal story and the story behind it and the motivations. And I really appreciate your questions, because I think through the questions we might get there. So in terms of my background, I think that's kind of how I arrived at my scholarly interests. I think it's important to say that, again, it's a bit circumstantial, I guess. So I was born in Moldova, Eastern Europe, and around the end of the Soviet Union. Very soon my parents migrated to Greece, and then my brother and I reunited with my parents, so we were raised and have lived in Greece since. And I think the first exposure in my life was that migration context, right? So that the being exposed to the challenges that come with migration, with a different cultural context. Domestic violence is an issue that occurs within migrant families, and it doesn't mean at higher frequency, but it's perhaps more visible because, again, it's the context I was living in. And also the inequalities that one sees in society when one migrates. So I think that was the first exposure I had as an individual, and it stayed with me. And I think I've been very philosophical, very inquisitory since my early age as a personality. And so I always wanted to pursue perfect knowledge. I always wanted to know why the world is the way it is and how we can address these issues. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew that I was looking for something. And so I pursued, working on my own. There was no support from migrants at the time, although I do appreciate the hospitality of the Greek people. I have to say that. I consider it my second home. I worked and I finally got a scholarship to obtain a liberal arts education in the US. And of course, that has been truly empowering, truly transformative. I have a talk at my graduation at Bates College in Maine, where I actually discussed this and the effects of that education. But at the same time, it exposed me to this, the dominance of Western epistemology, the dominance of Western knowledge and theory and representation in knowledge production and in representations of the world, in theory making, in paradigm setting. On the one hand, I was seeking that knowledge because that's how I thought I perceived the reality around me. I thought that to get that state-of-the-art knowledge, I had to travel to the US to get that knowledge. But at the same time, arriving there and being exposed to some of the literatures that I dealt with early on, which was primarily international development literature, preoccupied with what used to be called demeaningly underdeveloped countries or developing countries. I really disagree with those terms. I like to speak about low and middle income societies in terms of economics, if one needs to categorize. And so I got exposed to that literature, and especially agricultural economics and agricultural development in Africa. I was working for economics faculty on, agricultural economics. And there was this gender paradigm being quite mainstreamed at the time. It was all about gender and, including women for development and so on. So it was at the peak of its, kind of streamlining that paradigm. And so I found that a bit, disappointing, I guess, and worrisome, because you see, I came from a society that is low income, Moldova, which again is represented as backwards, as unequal, women as being perhaps in inferior positions or abused or mistreated, whatever the representations may be. And so when I was reading the literature about the African countries that were being dealt with in those literatures, I felt very much at home. I felt that injustice. I felt that, well, this is not right. Something needs to be done to actually nuance these representations, because intuitively, I didn't know at the time about epistemological colonialism. I had no idea, but I felt in my heart that something was wrong. And so, personally, I thought, look, I come from a low-income family. Obviously, I was raised in where at the time was economically advanced Greek nation. Now, with the crisis, it's a different status. But obviously, my parents raised me the cultural way that they had inherited from their country, and yet I was never, differentiated between my brother. I have an older brother. We were offered the same opportunities. I never felt disadvantaged in any way, and I was able to seek my dreams, and I never felt constrained. And so I thought, well, I am the product of that society. So why is that society presented in very generalizing brushes? Because I am the product of that society. And of course, there are groups that are disadvantaged. There are females that have different stories, but I am also one story, right? So we must account for all stories. And so what I did in that year, I created a project, and I was very fortunate to obtain a Thomas J. Watson scholarship, which is awarded to a few graduates in the US each year, to actually implement my own project. And I was a little adventurous. I said, okay, I'll go on a peregrination of the African continent to try and interview the farmers so that I hear their own testimonies, how they think about these issues. Why is it that their voices are not captured in the literature? Why is it that you need a Western researchers or a foreign researcher to theorize the realities when you could directly ask them? You know, I just couldn't understand this logic of making theory first before actually asking about people's experiences. And I felt that the international development language is almost, in philosophical terms, it's a technocratic, dehumanized language that it has created a suprastructure over the actual societal structure. So instead of describing the actual societal structure in people's worlds, we have created a technocratic language that is entirely disconnected from human reality, and it feels very inhuman, very unreal, unfeeling. I don't know how to explain it. This was my experience.
It perpetuates those inequalities, right? The farmers reading it would not be able to kind of
access it or even to comprehend it. Exactly. And so, I found problematic that the theory was not happening in parallel to the practical experience and the interaction with the communities. You see, theory in itself, theorizing is not a bad thing. It's important for us to generalize and theorize because this is how humans operate. But at the same time, theorizing has to happen in parallel to being exposed to those phenomena. Sorry, my cat is in the way. She's coming. And every time I speak, she likes to listen in. And so, you know, it should be an interdependent relationship. We need to be able to understand first the experience of the people to try and theorize and create a model around that experience. A theory is a model. And so I think we reached a paradigm, as I criticize in my book, whereby theory has become a telos in itself, and you know, an end point in itself. But actually, theory is a means to an end. Right? Theory should help us to try and understand the context in order to be able to respond to a problem, to have social impact, to be impactful in some way, to be useful in some way. The idea that theory in itself has value without application, I think, has very colonial implications, which need to be revisited. So this was something that I was thinking for a very, very long time in my career. And then going to Africa and spending a year, based on my contract, I couldn't leave, a year in 4 different African countries, very diverse politically, culturally, economically, religiously, specifically Ghana, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. I spoke to more than 300 farmers. I visited more than 60 rural communities, small towns and villages. And I think I lived more like an ascetic. I think that's when I really reconnected to my faith as well, and I found my faith. So that's a different journey. But those journeys happened in parallel. You know, as I was discovering the world and its problems, I also discovered that perhaps the only security or the answers that I was looking for could be found in my faith. You see what I'm saying? And what was that answer? The answer was, what is a better approach to what is happening now? If the approach that we're using now is quite arrogant or maybe generalizing or maybe centralizing, what is the alternative? And as I discussed in my book, which I'll come back to, the alternative is actually a humble approach and a sort of humility that we need to embody as researchers and individuals. And of course, that's very much influenced by my own Orthodox faith and praxis as well. So anyways, since then, you know, I really, having interviewed all these farmers and seeing the hospitality in these communities and the diversity in gender relations, you know, yes, in many societies there are patriarchal relations. Men, women seem to have less authority in decision making, you know, in mobility, less access to resources, especially when it comes to agricultural development. That is absolutely true, and there are biases because most development agents are male, you know, and there's multiple parameters involved. But at the same time, there are a lot of negotiating spaces for women, and there's a lot of agency being practiced that we don't see, we don't want to see. So I think when we generalize and essentialize from an outsider perspective, we actually do not honor the individual agency of the people, and we really need to understand their context and why they decide in the ways they do, and why they use the tactics and the strategies they use in terms of influencing decision around them, the way women, wives might behave with their husbands. So, for us, it might seem as if they are servile, but it might not be. It might be a negotiation strategy that we don't know about because we don't understand the context and we don't understand the thinking behind the practice. So anyways, that subsequently, I have been trying to find and develop ways that allow us to do gender sensitive research, because I do believe and I do appreciate the feminist critique, and I think, of course, it's a valuable contribution to human history and activism and societal improvement. But at the same time, there are these hidden colonial legacies in how we conceptualize gender relations, which again I will discuss in more detail soon. And so we need to find a way of doing gender sensitive analysis in diverse contexts of the world without assuming the nature of gender relations a priori, or the definition even of gender, because that tends to be defined by people's own languages and conceptual repertoires based on the cosmologies they ascribe to. And so not only find ways to do research that is culture sensitive, faith informed, but also to use the research then to respond practically, to apply the research, to use it for societal benefit, and not just to produce research that is then taken back to a Western academic center, and it's not returned to the community, and it doesn't have a benefit. So, my life's goal and objective in the past 10 years has been that, to not only do the talk, but walk the walk, as we say, to embody that as a person myself, as a believer, as an activist, as a researcher, but also to turn this research that I have produced and I'm able to produce, given the blessings I have, the funding I have, and the capacity I have, which is a privilege, to be able to turn that into practical benefit for those who are most, to whom it's most relevant to, right? And not in the way that we preceive as societal benefit. So actually, to make a valuable contribution, but not in the ways we consider or preconceive as valuable, but actually have the conversation with the communities to understand how what we do could be valuable to them and how can we make that happen. So I hope that answers your question.
That's great. And I really appreciate your emphasis on that humility of the researcher or of the developer, right, as someone coming into it as an outsider, and then privileging the people who are living in those contexts first, right? And then using that knowledge that you're producing, not just to be stored away in some ivory tower or theorized, but then to be engaged and made practical. And you're involved in several initiatives. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about those that help translate that knowledge and those findings into kind of practical ways to help improve people's lives. So let's turn to the book now. If we might tell us a little bit about your monograph here after, as you said, after so many years of thinking and research and case studies. How did you come to do research in Ethiopia on this topic? You shared a little bit in your introduction with us about kind of your own kind of migrant history and faith context that led you to some of these questions. But just for our audience, those who haven't read it, what is the book about and what do you hope will be its kind of impact?
Yes, well, thank you. That's this is a real test of whether I can summarize the book in a few brief sentences.
This is the challenge.
It's a challenge. No, I've done it a lot now. I think I'm used to it, but it's a complex argument. It's really hard to. You've read it. It's really hard to narrow down the multiple objectives and then the nuances that emerge from the study. But ultimately, I had the experience already described. So I was thinking around these colonial legacies in Western scientific knowledge production in general, but also in the gender and development paradigm specifically, which was that gender sensitive lens applied within international development studies and also public health. When I was in Ethiopia in particular, I think that is when I started reading more on domestic violence as an issue. And I'm not exactly sure how I arrived to that the first time, but I do have to say that I appreciated all the contexts I work in. And then later my master's was in Senegal with a Muslim Sufi community, in fact, so what I did is after coming back from that first project I did, I kind of lived a year in my house and I was thinking, I'm really disillusioned with education. I don't want to go back to it. What can I do to change this epistemological injustice. I am one person. I really, my voice doesn't matter, doesn't have value, because to have a voice, for your voice to be validated, you have to have a position in a Western institution. You have to be someone, as we say in this system. So I was nobody. And I kind of prayed, and even I stayed at a monastery at St Macrina in Kiveri in Greece to contemplate. I was thinking of actually becoming an ascetic myself, because I was just disillusioned with life and the injustices of it. But after a year, I felt that I had a calling to fight in this kind of, a realm. There's multiple realms where you can give your fight in this life. So
this is your monastery, so to speak.
This is my monastery. Yes, exactly. This is my struggle. We'll see where it takes me. But I thought, let me give it a try. And I kind of developed my own participatory approach, where I combined ethnographic methods with participatory kind of action research methods, if people are familiar with those, to do a very short-term master's level fieldwork research in Senegal with a Muslim community, Sufi Muslim community following the Tijaniya Brotherhood, on gender relations and how to improve gender relations within the religio-cultural knowledge system and worldview of the people, respecting their own values and standards in terms of gender. And I knew the mayor. We had been friends for a very long time, and so he trusted that I would be able to respect the local context, and he was very keen for me to be exposed. So I traveled 3 times. I stayed at, I think, 10 days each time, and I implemented this method to demonstrate to international development practitioners that you actually don't need to do long-term anthropological research to try and engage with the community. You can achieve that insight. Of course, it's not going to be the same depth of insight that you would achieve with the long-term anthropological, highly reflexive research, but you could still achieve some sort of understanding of the local normative system in terms of gender relations and how religious and cultural influences might play into that relationship, right, and maintain those gender relations, and then how they can become part of, well, sometimes they're part of the problems that exist, but also they can become resourceful to responding to the issues that one might face in that community. So that was my master's. The approach precisely kind of reinforced my belief that it can work. It's an approach that allows us to include the communities. And it was really interesting because it's a very kind of traditional or a tradition-oriented community, and yet I had workshops that were gender mixed with men and women, and they're just very open in discussing issues, marriage and gender relations and so on. So that really reinforced my belief that there needs to be done a systematic deconstruction of the gender and development paradigm, this international development approach, and we really need to problematize how this paradigm is being kind of promoted and implemented within actual practice, and then try to find alternatives. So in this book, I not only try to produce this deconstruction of the theory that is being kind of assumed prior to its application. So that's a deconstruction of the concept of gender and how that concept has evolved, within Western epistemology. Because again, you see within Western discourse, ideas of humanity, what a human being is, changed over time. Initially, they were influenced by the Bible, right? Because those tended to be religious societies. Then they secularized. You had Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment struggles to liberate the mind from theology. And so the history of Western societies led open many concepts to scientific inquiry, because before that, they were, discussed in theological terms, which is really interesting because in these societies where I'm currently in, they're still discussed many times in theological terms. And so they became open to scientific inquiry, and gender, for instance, is oftentimes conceptualized, in terms of post-structuralist philosophy, which is much more fluid, than what the perhaps more rigid conceptualizations that you might find, in non-Western tradition-oriented contexts. And so I kind of wanted to deconstruct that theorization, how it evolved, how the history of Western societies with religion influenced that theorization, and to evidence that, well, actually other societies didn't go through that historical series of events, right? And that genealogy of thought. They had their own genealogies of thought and their own worldviews. And so they didn't arrive to the same conclusions, right? And so we can't apply a theory that is the product of our own culture, of a Western cultural experience, if I may say, to another context, just because we think that, the gender asymmetries are shared. Yes, I don't disagree at all that gender inequalities are pervasive. While societies might differ, I don't think we can say that one society is unequal and another is not. I think inequalities are pervasive. They don't have boundaries, they're not limited to territory. But I do believe that each society is different and has a different historical experience and different gender arrangements. And we need to understand them within that context and historical development. So that is what I do. And then I look specifically at the gender-based violence paradigm as well, because that is very much linked to the concept of gender. So the way the concept of gender and then the concept of violence were questioned, again, open to scientific inquiry within Western societies, influenced how the gender-based violence paradigm was theorized later on. And that paradigm, again, places much emphasis on what I like to call a single etiology, which is the etiology of gender inequality. So in most cases, the unequal gender relations are considered conducive, the main reason that women's abuse, is perpetuated and maintained and so on. So patriarchal relations, lack of decision-making agency, and so on. Lesser opportunities, lesser economic options, and so on for women, which of course are important parameters, but they're not the only etiologies of domestic violence. So I was really keen to integrate psychological theories of violence, because this is what I was exposed to in my own migration context, where human psychology was very pertinent to how people behave and to understand human behavior. And so the argument is made that, while the theory is very important, it's important that we don't separate it or isolate it from other theoretical frameworks. So this moves in line with the ecological model of violence that, a lot of feminist scholars would speak about. But the problem with the ecological model of violence is that it's more talk than practice. So yes, ideally we want to look at the individual, the community, the system all at once. But the question is, in action, does that really happen? And so we need a more integrated model to understand violence that integrates family studies, psychological insights, gender-sensitive analysis, all these parameters to really understand the complexity of the problem, because it doesn't have a single etiology, a single factor explanation. It's multiple factors that are defined by the individual story and the context and so on. So that is the critique. And then what I want to, as I said, I like to talk and then walk the talk, I guess. And so what I'm trying to actually do there is to demonstrate that there is an alternative way of doing it. So kind of what I understand as a decolonial method, and again, I can go back to why I chose the term decolonial, but my critique is a critique from the margins. That's what I call it in the preface. It's a critique from the margins because I'm from the margins of the Western epistemology, in a sense. It's really an effort to demonstrate that we can do a gender-sensitive analysis without assuming what gender means, what femalehood or malehood means in the local context, what personhood means in the local context, or what subjectivity or individuality means. That we can actually take an exploratory, reflexive approach, while still being conscious that there are possible inequalities, being conscious of those and not missing them, because that's the importance and the value of the gender-sensitive analysis. But doing so that we actually conceptualize gender within the local people worldview and conceptual repertoire through the people's own discourses, is what I like to say, describe their own world through their own words. That's the beauty of I believe a truly decolonial approach. And again, the reason I chose to use the term decolonial is not to suggest that that's my term or my innovation, because obviously decolonization movements have started, at least since the 1950s and much earlier. But, physical decolonization movements, and then we have the kind of renewed decolonization movements in terms of decolonizing epistemology and knowledge production. And so I rely on a lot of exceptional scholars and researchers, decolonial and researchers who don't call themselves decolonial, but are decolonizing epistemology. Yes, because again, this is a term that I think it's a bit anachronistic. We apply it on people afterwards, but now it's become popular. But a lot of decolonial thinkers existed prior to us that never called themselves decolonial. So I quote Oyeronke Oyeyumi, the Nigerian anthropologist who has done an exceptional critique of gender theory within Western epistemology. Saba Mahmood, the Pakistani anthropologist who produced an ethnographic study of the Dawa movement in Egypt. Talal Assad, another Saudi Arabian anthropologist. So, I try to really work with other critiques that have existed and just add value and just a step further, I guess, suggest a step further, and how that would apply in the international development sector, because we're not talking about anthropology here, we're talking about a practical sector, practice-oriented sector. So I chose Ethiopia because Ethiopia, when I went there, and again, I had a lovely experience in all the countries. It was more circumstantial and personal, I guess. I felt very connected because of the Eastern Orthodox faith background that I have. In Ethiopia, at the time especially, one of the predominant faiths was Ethiopian Orthodox Theological Christianity. I spent quite a bit of time in Tigray, where currently, unfortunately, the war is ongoing, the conflict. And I just felt so much connected to the people of Tigray because they had such a simple, ascetic life. And I just felt that they were so connected to their faith, and it's a very kind of, I will discuss this, very Old Testament oriented lifestyle. And so it felt very genuine, and I felt at peace. So for me personally, it just spoke to my heart, and I wanted to contribute a study somewhere where people would appreciate it, where I could add the most value. And I had a lovely relationship with the people as well. I think that played a role. And then as an anthropologist, as a researcher, you have to think of the practical issues of research, right? How do you create that entry point with your participants? How do you create that trust? Because there's no possibility for research unless there is some trust. And when you do sensitive research, such as research on domestic violence, trust is absolutely major. You can imagine. And so I felt that the shared Orthodox background could be that entry point. Our lifestyles were similar. I was kind of an ascetic people who had a very simplistic lifestyle as well. And so, simple, not simplistic, simple lifestyle. And so I felt that I could live there and we could connect and so on. And then as countries, Moldova and Greece were, experienced, the Ottoman occupation, the precursor of Moldova for 300 years, Greece for 400 years. Ethiopia saw and experienced what we know as the invasions of Mohammed Grain in the 16th century, so Muslim invasions that left a lot of destruction of churches and monasteries. And so there was that shared history. Again, not to incriminate, any faith or any group, but it was a historical phenomenon that we shared, so we could relate to each other's occupations and experiences of occupations, if that makes sense. And then, of course, the Italian invasion, both in Greece and Ethiopia, more or less at the same time, by Mussolini. So it felt like home. I'm stressing this because there is a tendency, and a lot of scholars in the West have made careers on the basis of research in Africa and Asia and exotic places, where they literally will choose the most exotic place and go there and say, okay, now I'm going to do, a seminal study, which I find absolutely despicable. I'm sorry, it's just not what I stand for. For me, it was life's contingencies. God sent me there. I can speak about my faith, I think, at least in this context, very openly. I think it was just very personal, and it happened the way it did. And again, for me, it was the question was always, I am nobody. I have no power whatsoever in this life. Where can I add value with my minimal existence, my infinitesimal existence? And for me, it was, okay, go where people might actually be able to benefit from what you do, add value. And there wasn't much research done on like an ethnographic study of domestic violence in Tigray, Ethiopia specifically. So I really wanted to fill that gap. So I hope that answered your question. I might have lost track of it speaking too long.
Oh no, it was very insightful. And reading your book, I was very much struck by the way your own identity, as you mentioned, being an Orthodox Christian woman and a scholar, shaped your interactions. So in one place you mentioned how there was like a gathering of maybe 12 priests or so that you were invited to. And I mean, that to me is kind of remarkable, even, in a North American context of like, oh, there's just, a gathering of clergy. And then we have this one laywoman scholar coming along as well. And then you also mentioned that several men would come to you for theological insights, especially if there was a sensitive moral issue, maybe they felt embarrassed to ask their priest about. And then you also described some various interactions with local women. So can you speak to a little bit about how your positionality in your research, how that being Orthodox, being a woman, you said you felt this kind of shared sense of being at home in this Ethiopian and Tigray context, but maybe share with us a few examples of how your authority and your position was received in that context.
Yes, that's a very good point. So the major argument of this book, I think, or at least one of the major arguments, is that research is not objective. There's no objective knowledge, essentially. There's no objective research process. Everything is subjectivity grounded. That's what I like to kind of call it in the book. And that means that when we do research, we do it through our subjectivity. We can't, isolate ourselves from who we are and do the research and then come back to our bodies, right? That's what I mean. It's subjectivity grounded. So that means that who we are, our life's experiences, our own analytical lenses, our own theoretical lenses will influence the way we approach the research, so will influence our behavior with our participants, will influence how we receive the information they share, how we analyze, how we make sense of the discourses that we are listening to, right? We're hearing. So that's what I mean, that everything is subjectivity based. And when I say there's no objectivity, I mean very simply, to be objective, you have to be omniscient. You have to know everything, and then you'll be able to make a balanced judgment, correct? We cannot know everything precisely because we're limited by our own subjectivity. And so that's what I mean. You can't have objective knowledge production. Of course, you can have rigorous research. You can have research that is valuable. But how do you do that? That's the question. That's the main question of my book. That's at the heart of the question. If we cannot produce objective research, and if all research is subjectivity grounded, then what should we aim for? And a lot of kind of critical decolonial authors would speak about reflexivity, which is absolutely essential and key, and I agree with that. So being reflexive of all the judgments we make in the field, being aware of why we make those judgments, the limitations around us, the tentative nature of all research, and so on. But I think in addition to reflexivity, and maybe perhaps going a bit further, what we need is self-awareness. Because I think, you see, if everything is subjectivity grounded, that means that everything is biased by default. That's just the nature of life. So the only thing we can really do, we cannot pretend that we're not biased. We're just all biased. So the only thing we can do is say, okay, what are my biases that I really need to keep in mind as I go into this research to remember to challenge consciously? And I really think that this is healthier than trying to pretend that we are objective and good scholars and we're doing the right thing. Well, we're not. We're all flawed, and I think we have to be more aware of that. And that's why I spoke about humility, being able to understand how that our positionality is at the heart of research. And this is this kind of second element of the book's critique, that a lot of practice in international development is just theory and then application. The process of research itself, or the process of analysis, and the role of the practitioner in that analysis is entirely missed. It's never discussed. It's what I term a cosmological and linguistic translation. So it's that translation that happens at the time of analyzing that context, and then prior to implementing whatever program you're implementing. So that's never part of the discussion at all. But of course, our positionality defines that experience, right? So for me, it was absolutely key and essential to make that positionality transparent throughout the book. I actually created a methodology and an approach which was all about making the I transparent. So I kept a diary, I think it was about 300 pages at the end, of what I did in each interaction with my participants, how I might have influenced their responses, what was the context of that discussion, because, again, the way you respond will determine how the other person will respond. So it's, you have to consider your role in that interaction. I also, as you mentioned before, tried to learn languages, multiple languages, to be able to not only access the theological and exegetical local tradition, but also to be able to communicate with all the participants. And while some of them spoke Amharic, especially the males, tended to be more educated, were educated in higher numbers. the older generation of women hadn't been to school. And so Tigrinya was absolutely essential and key to learn to be able to communicate with women. And finally, introducing the participatory approach, again, not only for me to have a platform to discuss with the participants, but actually to turn the participants into cultural analysts. So I would actually collect data and then ask the participants to interpret it for me, which was, I think, a very interesting way of doing it, because again, each person might have had a different interpretation, and that really tells you how tentative your interpretation is. You know, when you see the diversity at play, you actually become a bit more humbled by that, and you're thinking, well, now I have to be quite careful of, you know, not essentializing the interpretation. And so I try to make that positionality quite transparent in dialogues. You know, sometimes I quote not just people's speeches, but also how my interaction with them, the whole dialogue, so that people can see the role I played in that discussion. And then in terms of how positionality was an advantage or a limitation, the second part of your question, you see in anthropology, we talk a lot about the outsider-insider divide. And I think we all agree that actually it's somewhere, you're always somewhere in between in a way, in most cases. I was kind of an insider in respect to faith, you know, and the Orthodox tradition, and you know, having studied the church fathers and the tradition closely, as you mentioned, people trusted that I had some understanding of the tradition. I spoke their languages. I hang out with the monks, the local monasteries. They would come to my compound. I would hang out with the clergy, you know. So people felt that, you know, I was part of that group and understood their tradition and respected it, of course. And many times, of course, they would know that I'm Greek Orthodox. You know, I would always tell them I have this background, so please, you know, don't misunderstand. You know, I want you to know exactly where I'm coming from and who I am. But I've studied your tradition, and I think I understand certain aspects of it, and we would have a conversation about it. And eventually people, you know, see, I think because of my lifestyle, which was very simple, I was literally living in a compound with afar, as we say, with earth, you know, like everyone else, and fasting most of the times, again, just my personal choice as well. People appreciated the commitment, I think, and appreciated that asceticism, again, because it's very much reminiscent of the ascetic model they've inherited. And I think that created more trust in me and also my knowledge of Orthodox theology. So I had a lot of males coming in, especially when I started to do interviews with males a bit later in the research, when I became more fluent. And they would come and they would actually say, you know, I have been tempted, you know, to be adulterous or to commit, you know, some sort of abuse. But, you know, because of, I think it's a sin, I haven't done it. And then they would come and tell me, you know, what do you think about it? What would the church say? What would be the response of the faith? Or how should I respond to that? One time I had a male, and I discussed this in my book, who was in a dilemma. He loved his wife. His wife was a lovely wife, had birthed him many children, which is very valued in the local society, but he felt attracted to another woman. And so he came to me and he said, so what do you think? I think I love this woman, or I love this woman. He used the word, I have love for this woman. Is this real love by the Orthodox faith? You know, which one is real? Because I love my wife, but I also am attracted to this other woman. And so, you know, I would always first and foremost advise them to ask their church, a spiritual father, because that's what is appropriate in the local society. I just didn't want to step on the, you know, right. As we say in Greek, in the fields of someone else's field. So I would always send them to their spiritual fathers, but also I would also respond as a person, because I never pretended to be objective or uninvolved. I was always involved in everything, you know. And so I would always give my opinion, but I would always tell people which one is my opinion, which one is the teaching of a church father, and which one, when that teaching was mostly Greek Orthodox influence or Ethiopian Orthodox influence. So I would try to be as much transparent as I could. And in that instance, I think I said something about something Pauline, you know, based on St. Paul's teachings, and then St. John Chrysostom's exegesis, which was, you know, that in the end, true love falls within the law of God, because God himself, his nature is love. So if something falls out of God's law, then one might understand that is not everlasting. So if it's not everlasting, then it's not true. And so I think through that kind of, he understood, and he stayed silent, and then he kind of contemplated and left. So I don't know what people took out of these discussions, but you can see that I was very much engaged in that research. And because I was engaged, I could understand the things I was able to understand. I could see a little bit more of people's own mindsets and what they had in their internality, because we can never see, we can never know. We have no full knowledge of ourselves. So we can never know someone else. And this is the second point I had on positionality, that it wasn't only my positionality, it was also the positionality of the participants. Again, participants are intelligent human beings, like all of us. They're strategic with what they share. They're going to tell you what they think is necessary for you to hear, or what they can share safely. Because again, in the rural context, gossip is very much feared, because gossip then portrays you might portray in very negative terms, and then that has social implications. So you must be very careful with gossip. And then it's a society based on reciprocity. So you don't want for something to happen that would break your relations with a neighbor, because then that reciprocity mechanism wouldn't work. So for instance, people would have religious gatherings every few days, saints days and so on. And so one family would hold the religious gathering and everyone else would have to come. If you didn't go, nobody would come to you. So you see this mechanism of reciprocity. And so what I'm trying to say here is that it was important to not only pay attention to my discourse and my influence on the participants, but also how the participants' own identities and conditions and location within social relations define their behavior towards me and define their responses. It was a very complex analysis. I have just a paper on how I was trying to kind of understand the psychology of conversation, and then try to analyze the discourse of the participants, and not what they said, but what was not said and was said between the lines. The non-discursive part was much more important in many cases than the discursive part. So definitely positionality was key, both methodologically, so in terms of the critique I was making, but also in terms of being able to do the research in a reflexive manner that I hope to do. Yeah.
You mentioned in the book a couple times how I think one of the words was gender. At one point you asked your participants about gender and they were just kind of like, it's not really, the responses were very limited. And then you couched it, what does it mean to be a good wife? What does it mean to be, a good husband? And this generated a lot more response. So could you speak to us a little bit about some differences in the ways the communities you were involved with understood abuse, equality, and things like gender or religion that maybe are surprising to a Western audience, but also, inform the work that you're trying to do around abuse and violence. Also, if we categorize those things differently or understand these things, how does that engage that development aspect?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I like that you mentioned that incidents. Indeed, in one of the workshops, because I was trying to be as exploratory as I could, and one of the first questions before even getting to marriage and gender relations, I was to ask people how they conceptualize the woman and the man. What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a man? And that question made very little sense to people, because it's not like they'll sit down and start philosophizing. People will, of course, have reflection and will theorize things. There's no that, but their lifestyle is much more physical. People have to be in the field. People have to rear children. It's not like they're going to start questioning concepts that they might take as granted, because that's their life. They see female and male bodies, and that's kind of what they observe. And so it wasn't a question that people engaged with. And then the next question was, okay, what does it mean to be a wife, and what does it mean to be a husband? And that was a question that really got people talking, because again, you see, they defined it in relation to a context, right? In relation to a function. And so gender in itself actually was not something that was questioned, that we within feminist discourse, we sit and question and theorize. That's not something that happens in the community. People would also not question gender roles. It was quite clear that women had their own roles and men had their own roles. What people would take issue with is the inequality in the distribution of labor. And it's not that women argued that men should do women's work, not even that, as I said. women would just ask that men do their own part, which oftentimes they fail to do. Because again, this is a very patriarchal kind of arrangement whereby the male is the breadwinner and the female rears the children and takes care of the household. In the rural context, women might not work. They might weave some cotton or do some small work, but not a paid salary. They wouldn't have a paid salary. So the breadwinner is the male in those terms. And so if the breadwinner is not bringing the resources in order for the woman to buy oil and salt and make injera, the bread, the traditional bread, then that would result in conflict. That would mean that the woman cannot fulfill her duties as a wife. That would mean that she's not a good wife. She cannot function as a good wife, and so that would frustrate her, because then someone could say that she's a bad wife, and then her husband could use that against her and separate her, right? So you can see how important it was, these standards of being a good wife and being a good female, and then obviously, as we were talking about being a good wife, that led us to actually question what is a good woman, a female trait, what is a good characteristic for a wife. And so people generally in this society, for women to be humble, to not be argumentative, to always be loving with their husbands, to never be judgmental and critical with them. These were the kind of standards that dominated. And these were told by women to me, women kind of reported and explained what these standards were. And they took them as normal and natural and just what it is. And so, it was really important to understand, again, how people thought around gender, gender standards in their own terms and why they thought the way they did. And then to try and, so obviously my interest was to understand if there was a religious influence behind those conceptualization, right? And then how theology might help us to respond to these inequalities or whatever understandings might exist that might perceive females and males as unequal. And so it emerged that, when people thought about gender, they thought of the human. So under the concept of gender was the concept of human, what I said before for Western feminists. The way people thought about gender was defined by how they thought about the human being itself. All right. So the human being was an entity that had both that had biological, sociological, and spiritual elements. So it was this multidimensional entity, right? And so it was not possible to pin down gender to say, well, this is a social element or biological or a spiritual. It was part of the human entity, and the human entity was this multidimensional entity that was partially biological. And so people thought that you couldn't change the human personality easily, perhaps not at all in some cases. And this was at the heart of their explanations of abusiveness. Most participants would say, well, it's his personality. It's a personality problem. It's not his father's his socialization, his parents' context. It's his personality. And they would say personality is natural, in Amharic. And so the implication here was that, well, since it's natural, we can't really change it, so we don't need to bother. Why try if it's something that we can't change it unless the person wants to change? So it was actually a very refined etiology, a very refined thinking about it, But the problem was that there was a double standard. While people would say, well, everyone has a personality, male and females, and people would say, every woman, every man can fulfill the kind of religious standard, of likeness to God, which was the, kind of the spiritual standard, I guess. And everyone can achieve eternal lives, the lalem, as we say in Amharic. So it was for both men and women. There was no distinction whatsoever. And people, as you know, venerate highly Saint Mary in this tradition in particular. So there are female role models that are very much looked up to. But there was a double standard, because while people would say, well, nature is a bit like a biological thing, it's just determined by itself, by God. They wouldn't say it, but the implication was that it's determined. At the same time, they would say, well, it's more natural for men to be abusive and more unnatural for women to be abusive. So they would say, well, if a man becomes abusive, we kind of justify it a bit because that's how men are. But if a woman becomes abusive, she becomes a non-female. She risks being considered a non-woman material. It's just is I have, for instance, in Ethiopia, oftentimes been called a male because I'm very confident in my argumentation. So just to give you a sense of how this goes. And so you can see how the social experience, how can I say, that it might be a discourse about natural ideas, but actually the discourse is socially constructed and socially defined. And so there is a double standard. And this becomes an opportunity afterwards, because you see, within religious language, that differentiation between an inclination to be more abusive for men and women wouldn't be made. It would be the same standard applied for males and females. And those who become abusive would be held accountable for their own decision. They are responsible for their actions, and they can use religious conscience to deter themselves from becoming abusive. That is the discourse of the faith, and that is applied to both. So that discourse could then become a response to this very deeply ingrained idea within the local community. So you see how subtle and refined it is? Yeah. But you see, you could respond to it using Western feminist language or human rights language. But the issue here is that people would feel that it's a foreign language. It's irrelevant. It doesn't really understand where they're coming from.
We are in, I mean, you've given such wonderful answers. If we have just a few minutes left in our time together, and I want you to have a moment to say something briefly about the initiatives that you're involved that work with religious leaders within the kind of drawing on those spiritual resources. And I think that's one of the questions that we had in the Q&A was about how do you work with church representatives to address these issues. So you could briefly tell us about that, and then I'll wrap us up.
Okay, excellent. And thank you so much for addressing picking up the question. So that was one idea of how we use the religious discourse to respond to these deeply ingrained kind of perceptions and standards and understandings of humanity, human nature, and personality and gender, right? The other way is to actually work with clergy, because another insight of the research was that the clergy are very influential. People themselves kind of named the clergy and the spiritual father as their first point of contact when they face marital issues. So the clergy emerged to be very influential. And what we did subsequently, this research has kind of been the point of reference. We have created a project which takes place in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the UK. So it's a more extensive and large project that aims to build on this research. So actually add more research this time with the male population to understand better how they experience domestic violence, how they think around it, and the influence of religious conscience in their behavior. More research with victims as well. Again, understand the role of faith in coping, perhaps. And then it has intervention components to actually work with the clergy of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to train them in those matters around marriage, and understandings, kind of religious standards such as male headship, or female submission, which is a language that is oftentimes used in religious terms. To help them understand the true interpretation, the Orthodox interpretation, so that is the interpretation that the church fathers have provided for these excerpts, for these teachings, and really to answer also their questions, the real-time questions that they're receiving from the spiritual children. So obviously my research involved a lot of clergy. They were raising questions with me that they had no answers to. They felt not confident enough to give an answer. And of course, to raise their capacity to respond to domestic violence victims and survivors, respecting confidentiality and understanding the risks that women are facing. Oftentimes clergy will just mediate, go and talk to her husband, and of course that will create more risks for her. Right. So confidentiality, although there is confidentiality between spiritual child and priest, the confidentiality when it comes to the married couple is a bit of a challenge. So we're trying to train them. We're giving them ethnographic, theological, and safeguarding training currently. And then we try to actually create a bridge. Project Dildo means bridge, the one project that I've just mentioned. And we try to bring secular and religious stakeholders in the countries we work in to help them understand each other and to help them how to engage more productively with each other, especially, when you think about feminist organizations and the religious organizations, and really bridge these different theoretical approaches and understand why each one is doing something different. Because, at the end of the day, we're all working towards the same goal. And I think part of the explanation as to why we fail to collaborate is because we fail to understand why we use the approaches we use, where we're coming from. And so we're trying to do that mediation. And just to say that we're very conscious to add value and not to come in and suggest that there is a single approach that should be taken, but we're trying to just share that evidence that we're producing, and that those organizations might not have the capacity or funds to produce. And then it's their decision on whether they like to use it or how they'll put it to use.
Right. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Romina, and for all of you joining us today. Our next episode in this series will be Between Heaven and Russia, a conversation with Sarah Riccardi-Swartz, and that's April 27th at noon. We hope you'll be able to join us then as well. Thank you again so much, Romina. We really learned a lot from you today.